Join me in the audio garden to cultivate our collective wisdom, nurture creativity, and spread love. My name is Martha Senator. Welcome to Listen and Be Heard. Hello and welcome to episode 35 of Listen and Be Heard. I'm joined live in the studio by two very special guests, experts here in Asheville, North Carolina, Lengnick and Meredith Leigh. I had such a beautiful drive coming up here from Greenville, South Carolina. It was like the perfect day to just view all the beautiful colors. And I want to thank both my guests for being here. I want to thank Davian Dial, the station manager at WPVM, for giving us the opportunity to bring you this programming. Sorry, I should turn the music down a little bit. You could hear me better, right? And we're going to talk today, again, for our fall special, 2-hour special, about the rules of resilience, the 12 things that we can do, that we can all do to have an effect on climate change. And today we're going to be talking about 3 of those rules, but I want to start with a poem, a sort of giving thanks for us all being here together and to thank Mother Earth, which we all need to remember to do. So I'm going to bring to you the voice of Vanessa Lee Miller, a Hawaiian poet and language activist. And she shared a poem with us on episode 27 about why, the Hawaiian name for water. Please stay tuned.
Wailuku. Wailuku, the raging Kahawai, the river. Her ka holo, her long, sinuous journey begins as a watery, pencil-thin line, a mere trickle, mauka, way up high, looking towards Na Lani on Mauna Kea. Her awana is a graceful journey iho down slope towards rainy Hilo. Ai, Hilo ikaua kanilehua. As she continues to iho, journey down slope, a magical transformation ensues. From her embodiment of a graceful, delicate trickle, she widens, becoming voluptuous. She's now a raging beast, plunging turbulently downward, full of enna, capable of arbitrarily grasping in her watery fist a young, reckless life and smuggling it into one of her many deep, cavernous pockets in her slimy Anna. She'll stash it there, it's hers, until the pale, lifeless form struggles through a multitude of tempestuous undercurrents to surface somewhere evil down slope. But during the course of her journey, she leaves a trail of dazzling performances after week upon week of infinite drops of rain from Na'alani. Awestruck Malihini call these wonders Pi'ihonua Camp Cascades, boiling pots, rainbow falls. Old Hawaii calls them Puakana, Kuakanini, Pe'epe'e, Waiā Nui Nui. She weaves ever so gracefully, skirting around sacred, smooth boulders, leaving her mossy footprints of slippery limu. She continues to Awana in the wee hours of the morning. From my Hamakua-facing bedroom window, I hear her raging, bellowing sounds, drowning out the lonely, searching calls of the small, scaly river creatures of the night. Searching in blind rage, she leaves no boulder, no jagged rock, no slimy pebble unturned. River Mo'o waits, watching her every move, hearing her belches and snorts and eerie releases. He, shaking out the raindrops from his mane of writhing eels, belts out a wicked laugh. Get plenty time, he says, slowly, sharpening his battle-ready claws against the skull boulder. He waits patiently for the right moon. O Wailuku, you watery, undulating Wahineali'i, once a graceful trickle from Na'alani, you've morphed into a skull crusher, you stone carver, you mo'o slayer, so bloodthirsty for the fearless, sweet weed-scented swimmer. Or was it the claw of the mo'o, of the rain-drenched cave of goddess Hina, that dragged the young Baga into the murky depths? Upon reaching her deep, dark, limu-laden green mouth, Maka'olanakila, she forcefully surrenders, her full, swollen self plunging once more into the wide, stormy bay. Both river and sea currents reluctantly mingle. She truly is what old Hawaii called her, destructive waters. Wailuku, the river, life-giving, life-grasping, ruthless Kahawai. E Wailuku I kaua loku loku, e Wailuku I kaua kālai lepo, e Wailuku I kaua nohu ili, e Wailuku I kaua kālai pohaku, e Wailuku I kaua ho'omomona aina, e Wailuku I kaua makana nui I ka mahi ai.
Thank you to Vanessa Miller for that beautiful poetry to start us off right. I want to welcome Meredith Leigh and Laura Lengnick to the studio.
Hello. Hi there. Good to be here again.
Yes, it's great to have you.
Thanks for having
Meredith
us.
is the author of the Ethical Meat Handbook, and Laura is the author of Resilient Agriculture. And you may have caught it, you may have not caught it, but we did a 2-hour special in the summertime, and now it's the fall. And we're here to do another 2-hour special and to talk about some more of Laura's points in her book, Resilient Agriculture. She has 12 rules, but we could talk a lot about each of those rules, and so we're only going to attempt to talk about 3 of them today. Although, we don't actually have any rules when it comes to this conversation, so who knows what will happen, actually. But we're going to try to follow this. The 3 rules that we wanted to talk about today was following the 3 rules of resilience, which we can talk about in your profession and your community. That was number 1. Number 2 is learning a new resilient foodways skill. And number 3 is learning how your ancestors nourished their community. And we're talking about this because, as everybody knows, climate change is real, right, Laura? Right, Meredith?
Indeed.
So, following the 3 rules of resilience in your profession and your community, I guess we have to first say what those 3 rules are.
What those 3 rules are, yes. And in case anybody is having a little trouble following along, we're actually talking about 12 things that people can do. And one of those things is to follow the 3 rules. So what are the 3 rules? Very simply put, the 3 rules are: 1, to cultivate reciprocal relationship in all of your actions. The second is to cultivate regional self-reliance. And the third is to cultivate the common weal. And we can dig into those a little if you'd like, or we can address those through the conversation.
Well, I think we're already in conversation. And,
I think we're already.
And when we're talking about the 12 rules.
The 12 things.
The 12 things. I'm sorry, the 12 things. So one of the 12 things is to follow the 3
Those
rules.
Yes,
okay.
yes.
And that first one you mentioned, to cultivate diverse networks of reciprocal relationship.
Yeah.
Now, people listening, they might be asking themselves already, what does that have to do with climate change?
Yeah.
To cultivate reciprocal relationships.
Well, all 3 of these rules are actually much bigger than just addressing climate change. But the resilient agriculture focuses on how we can work within the food system to address climate change or find climate change solutions. So all 3 of the rules are actually much broader, and they're really speaking to a resilient community.
Okay, so we all need to learn to be resilient because there's been, dramatic changes in weather patterns and as a result, growing patterns. I've learned a lot of this from Laura's book, by the way. And so in order for us to, when we think about, well, what can I do as opposed to what should other people stop doing, maybe.
Or what could I stop doing?
Or what could I stop doing? Yes.
Doing?
Okay,
yeah.
What can I do? What can I stop doing? But in this case, we're talking about cultivating reciprocal. And I guess we could start with reciprocal relationship with Mother Earth. That's why I wanted to start with this poem, just celebrating water, because when we use water, when we plant crops, when we take those things, there needs to be reciprocity.
Exactly. And that's really the baseline for this this idea of reciprocal relationship. And it's a very deeply held, long-lived rule in how to live well on this planet. It's an indigenous expression of living within your ecosystem and being thankful and reciprocating for all the good that you receive. So just to get back to your original question, which is, so how do we do this and why does it matter to climate change? And what I found as I started digging into these rules of living on this planet and trying to make sense of them for myself in these times and in the context of climate change, what I began to see was that this first rule, living in reciprocal relationship, really has to do with how out of balance, that's not quite, I don't like to use that word, but how little in our culture today actually asks us even just to be grateful for what we have, much less return, give something in return. And so I think a simple example, and Meredith is nodding her head, so I'm going to let her get in here in just a second, but a simple example that's relevant to climate change is how much we've taken of the Earth's stored carbon, ancient sunlight, also known as fossil fuels.
Yes.
And what have we returned for all of that we've taken? And so that's an example of, I think, a very clear relationship between climate change and the first rule, which is cultivate mutual benefit or reciprocal relationship. You want to jump in here?
Sure. I love that, everything that you said. But I think for me in my work, there's just been a huge emphasis on helping myself and others understand that there is no what can I do. It's what can we do, right? And that the pervasive thinking that we are separate from nature and separate from each other is one of the fundamental issues with our dominant way of thinking.
That's
and
got
also,
us in this pickle, really.
Yeah, the reason that we find ourselves in relationships that are not reciprocal, and even zooming it out even further, we don't even necessarily consider ourselves to be in relationship, right? We don't necessarily define our conversation with the earth, with animals as a relationship, and let alone a reciprocal relationship, right? And we don't necessarily understand the gravity of that sense of separation or the value of a sense of relationship in changing the outcome, right, of our existence.
And
So-
Laura mentioned indigenous knowledge, I think you said. And I think that's what you're saying is missing, basically, Meredith. Like when you're talking or we're talking about culture and us, I think we're talking about American culture and the way we participated in it, whether we like it or not. Like you said, it's we, it's not I. So I can decide that I want to make a difference about climate change, but I myself can do things, but it's we who have to make a bigger impact, right?
Or if I do things, I need to also think about how they are connected and will impact other
people,
beings and other, I'm using air quotes around other because I think the sense of like
we is
the other is very sort of disastrous at this point, because everything's connected, and definitely indigenous cosmologies, that was just like the basic level understanding.
And we can all go back to that, though. Like when we
Sure.
say indigenous, we don't mean any particular indigenous group, but that indigenous wisdom that we all possessed if we go back far enough. And I think like here in America, we probably have this amnesia going back about 100 years or so, or even more, but that we've lost
even,
that connection to that indigenous knowledge that you're talking about.
I was going to say, or even less.
Okay.
And Meredith just mentioned, this othering that happens. And when I think about the sense of belonging and moving from I to we, I do think of it as belonging, as kind of all our relations or all my relations, and how any sort of action that I take influences a whole chain of other beings. And I think really important, and certainly deeply embedded in this first rule of reciprocal relationship, is just recognizing that we belong to a system of relationships. Whether or not we recognize it,
We're still in it.
we're in it.
Yes.
And I think one of the
You're participating whether you think you are
or
not.
not. Yeah. And so I think that's a huge shift in thinking,
So it's more about how we're reciprocating than whether we are or not, I think.
I think the first step is just recognizing that there are, for every action.
So how could we do that in our daily life? You know, we get up, we make a cup of coffee, say. Is there something in that act of making a cup of coffee that you can do to be reciprocal? Or is it just that, like, you have to be grateful for the cup of coffee, or when you go and you fill your tank with gas, or you're going, how actually do we engage in being more reciprocal as we go around and consume things and do the things that we do in our daily life?
Well, I think let's stay on the mindset really fast, because I think that there is something valuable about recognizing that we're alive and that that's a gift, right? And that, so if you think about receiving life as a gift, then you think about gratitude. And when we think about gratitude, we think about giving back. I think that's generally an acceptable way of thinking about how humans operate. Like when we recognize that that we've been given something, that we have received something, then we are more inclined to give and return. And I think to your earlier point, for people who feel removed from ancestry or feel alienated by all the discussion of indigenous knowledges because they are not themselves indigenous identifying people, I think that it's really important to understand, you do have ancestry, no matter your identity, that was in reciprocal relationship with the earth at some point. And secondly, the further removed you might be because of your identity from an indigenous way of thinking, chances are the more privilege you have, which means you can think about the gifts that you've received being plentiful, right? And so the reciprocity that you might be able to conjure could, and not always, potentially be even greater than you thought, before you were thinking about life as a gift or positionality as a gift, right?
So maybe not to think of it as transactional, which maybe a lot of us have a tendency to think transactionally, like, okay, I got this, I'll give this back. But maybe more about how we can actually change the way we live to be more reciprocal, or if we are so blessed, maybe we could actually take a real chunk of our time to consider how to give back to our community or in some other way. Do you think that?
Yeah, and I think, one of the things that came up for me when your poem was playing is that it really characterized that nature isn't just beautiful. It's also devastating, right? And similarly, we are beautiful and terrible, and because we're of nature, right? And so I think, and to the point of like being in relationship, it isn't our society or our dominant culture definitely pressures us to say, like, what is the outcome? What is the to-do? What is the transactional? That was a great word that you chose. Directive here, but as we know, like, there is a bit of a give and take there with nature that can be transactional, right? But it's broader than that. And so I think when we're talking about reciprocal relationship, we're talking about, I don't want to say the opposite of transactional because I don't want to create a binary, but we're talking about something relational. We're talking about something that moves at a different speed and with a different feeling, I think, than just like, oh, well, I drank a cup of coffee and pumped 20 gallons of gas today. What do I owe in return?
Maybe I'll give $20 to a charity.
Well,
call it even. Maybe that's not what we're looking for.
I don't think so.
No, I don't think so. I would just say that you were trying to describe, how do we get out of this idea of transaction? And for me, it's just so much richer. It's a rich interaction or set of relationships rather than just, I got this, I'm giving. And giving this back.
Leads. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, and so back to the cup of coffee. One of the privileges many of us have in this country is that we can choose the kind of coffee that we consume, and so choose coffee that there's benefits, many different benefits to the fact that you chose that coffee over another coffee,
Yes.
another type of coffee.
And even if you paid a little extra for it, I think that's something that you got to in the Ethical Meat Handbook, Meredith. You delved into that quite a bit, the actual cost of things as opposed to the cost that we pay at the cash register for different various things like organic or fair trade or grass-fed beef or whatever it may be, that you have to make that decision of what you're going to pay and realize the actual cost of what you're paying for, too, like in human
if you can
misery or whatever else it may be.
But it goes back to what we talked about last time, where like this sense that we are disconnected, right, from not only from each other and from the earth, but also from where our food comes from. It's all this pervasive mindset, but the closer we feel to the products that we consume and the more we understand how many other people's lives and animals' lives and plants, and soil are impacted by those decisions, the more connected and relational we feel with those decisions, right? And so I think it's about, that awareness that we started with of recognizing that we're connected. It opens a lot of doors of curiosity towards, oh, wait, how am I connected, right? And when we start opening those doors and looking into those things, it leads to very obvious actions, I think, of how we can make decisions differently, or we can find our blind spots and begin to talk to others and get into rich relationships that then teach us what we haven't known before. And there's that famous Maya Angelou quote of like, you do the best you can with what you know, and when you know better, you do better.
Absolutely. And that leads us really, I think, into the second rule of resilience, which is to cultivate regional self-reliance, which means cultivating those relationships, reaching out to the people around us, I think, and cultivating those relationships so that, again, it's not I am going to be self-sufficient, but we as a region are going to learn to support each other and be able to be resilient. Say, we spoke last time about when people were afraid that the grocery shelves would be empty during COVID. And that brought you, Laura, really to that realization of how important a subject that the foodways and regional self-reliance are. So how do we practice that in our daily lives as we're trying to, practice the rules of resilience?
Do you want to give that?
I just did a lot of talking, so you should.
Okay, I'll do some more talking. So this idea of self-reliance is actually in resilience science. It is I think it could be the most difficult rule for us to follow in these times. And that's because the rule asks of us or invites us to live life well within the limits of the ecology, the place where you live. And to do that in a way that doesn't require importing anything critical to living well or exporting anything, including waste. And so if you think about this second rule, regional self-reliance, and you think about climate change, the way we use energy is such an obvious violation of this rule because we import nearly all the energy we use, for example, in Western North Carolina, and we export all kinds of waste in terms of emissions, for example. So that's the basic idea behind this regional self-reliance, that we are able to live life well within limits of place. Very difficult to do in a culture that believes in extracting goods from all over the world and bringing them back here for us to enjoy and live the good life, air quotes, in the good life. Yeah. So you asked, how do we begin to change how we live? And then really the first thing to do is just recognize that that's That's how your good life is possible. And then to begin, pick something to begin to change. In this region, we have such a strong local food movement, for example. And so that might be a great way to get started. In fact, during COVID, many people in this region learned about the CSAs, for example, that they could actually go and once a week get
community-sponsored agriculture.
Yes.
You're talking about, right?
Sorry, yeah.
That's okay.
So basically it's a subscription to vegetables or to food grown locally or regionally. And many people, in those early days of the pandemic, as we were discussing before, looked around for where they could get food locally when the groceries started to have less on the shelves, and that's an example of one thing to do differently. Go find who's growing food in your region, and how can you begin to enjoy that food instead. And this is not, it's not no matter your advantages or disadvantages, this is something anyone can be a part of at some level. It may just be one food. Maybe it's just one ingredient every week or one ingredient a month that you make the effort to learn more about how you use that ingredient in a recipe, for example.
Okay. You're tuned to WPVM LP 103.7 in Asheville, North Carolina. My name is Martha Senator. The show is Listen and Be Heard. We're going to take a little break to play a little soundbite for you, and we will be right back.
Guides our climate justice strategy is we're redefining or more returning to a more true economy by centering our core values of home, traditions, and spirituality.
So that first stop wasting food, that is based on so much research that suggests that one of the top 5 most cost-effective, I think of these as win-win solutions. They're low cost and high impact. That stop wasting food is actually one of the top 5 things we can do to act on climate change. Just eat the food that you buy.
Everybody has a narrative related to it, and then I think the narrative just then begs the question of, like, what can I do?
The way we need to size our food sheds is to look at the capacity, the ecological capacity of a place to produce the foods that we need. And to be able to produce those foods without an ecological deficit.
I definitely felt pressure to have the answer and make it a one-size-fits-all thing. And then in the second edition of the Ethical Meat Handbook, I really changed on that and was like, look, we're all struggling with so many different and disparate contexts.
We are in the midst of a 2-hour special about what each of us and all of us together can do about having an effect on climate change. And I'm joined in the studio live here in Asheville, North Carolina, by Meredith Leigh and Laura Lengnick. And we were talking about the second rule of resilience, which is to cultivate regional self-reliance. And there's also a third rule, which we're going to address. We're trying to get through actually 3 of the 12 things that you can do that are in Laura Lengnick's book, Resilient Agriculture. And the first one of those 3 things is to follow the 3 rules of resilience. So I'm not trying to confuse you all, I promise. But so we were in the midst of talking about that second rule of resilience, which is to cultivate regional self-reliance. And we're going to kind of mix that up with the third one, which is to cultivate the accumulation of community-based wealth. And those are related. And then the all of that together was the first thing we can do, which is to practice those 3 rules in our daily lives, where we work, where we play, where we worship, or wherever we go, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So I think, to me, that sounds really great, to accumulate wealth in your community, right? And one example I think of all the time is, when we take out our credit card, and every time we do that, a little portion of what we spend goes to a bank somewhere out of town, unless it's, no, it's out of town somewhere, basically. So that's one way you're already losing cash out of your community that doesn't come back. But how can we not lose wealth, but actually accumulate wealth in our communities? How do we go about doing that?
Yeah. Well, first of all, understand that this idea of wealth is much broader than just financial.
Thank you. That was what I was going to say.
Yeah. Why don't you, let's hear what you think about this idea. Come on, Meredith.
Well, I have a lot of things to say, and there's something I'm struggling a little bit to compress all of the ideas that I have into the time that we have. But I guess when I started out, when I graduated from Warren Wilson College here in town, I was very committed to local food movement success, and I started farming. And I've been very focused on one way of building regional self-reliance and community wealth is investing in farmers and helping farmers make a living, and and then people in the community to be more nourished, right? Which is a different kind of wealth coming from thriving local food. I think that there are other ways outside of just food, all kinds of commerce and relationship where local or regional wealth is starved because of our system that we rely on. And I have since, in the 20 years that I've been working, have really started to, expand my thinking past food.
And also the definition of wealth. I guess I hear you saying that we, if we have a pantry full of food, that's a certain kind of wealth. If we have good relationships with people who we can rely on, that's another type of wealth, probably.
Mm-hmm. If we have businesses or communities of practice that we're proximate to that provide for community needs, right, and are justly compensated or contributed to by those receiving, right? That's a form of wealth.
Such as healthcare,
healthcare or laundry or name it,
anything that
right?
we need to do, right?
And so I think, there's tons of ways to think about building, regional resilience. And I think what Laura touched on initially about how trying to create regional resilience that eventually looks like not exporting or importing energy, that's the long game, and that directive may become very urgent at some point. But right now, I think we can, as you say, meet folks where they're at and start at approachable ways. One way being pick one thing, right? Because as you said, you can have a pantry full of food, and that is a form of abundance. But if that food is making you sick and you're in the hospital with an autoimmune disorder or chronic disease, that's not a form of wealth, right? And so there's a lot of nuance to this conversation. But I think, one of the things that I have just come to know very deeply is that we've got to, all 3 of these rules are connected. We have to work on all different kinds of reciprocity, all different kinds of wealth, all different kinds of mutual support, in order to walk ourselves towards a consciousness about regional resilience before we actually get this beautiful picture of resilience where we're not importing or exporting energy.
Yeah, and we just start.
Yeah,
we just need to start somewhere. Listening to what you're saying, what comes to me too in my own life as I've started working on doing these 12 things and living by these rules, what I find is they reinforce each other. Mm-hmm. So when you begin to do one, it gets easier to do the next thing. And there's a very powerful kind of interaction, relationship, critical mass that gets going. For example, you mentioned having a pantry full of food. That's a type of wealth, and that is. But how about if part of that food came from your yard?
Absolutely.
That
right.
deepens that whole. Or
yes.
How about if some of that pantry is full of food that you've processed yourself? What I have found is it feels almost like, one way to describe it, one way I think about it, it's like peeling back an onion. And what, for me, this work is doing in my own life, doing these 12 things, following these 3 rules, is actually, in my mind, peeling back the layers upon layer upon layer of, what's the right word for it? It's layer upon layer of modern culture or American culture. I can even get deeper and think about it as layer upon layer of colonialism. We can really go back and to find that core of what it means to live well on this planet. That really, for me, is what I'm doing in my real life. And that's how I think about it as well, even as I do something as simple as learning how to make sauerkraut.
Yes, and I have a story to tell, if I may.
Please.
So every once in a while I work at my friend's coffee shop here locally because I love it. I love the very transactional interaction with people of giving them a cup of coffee. And it's very simple and it makes them happy. And I get to interact with individuals. So I do that every once in a while. And I had an interaction with a woman, and I'm not surfacing when I'm at the coffee shop that I am a food professional or that I have deep knowledge of agriculture systems. But I had this interaction with a woman who came in with her daughters, lovely family. And the daughter came up and ordered first, and she ordered a iced coffee drink, mocha. It was called an iced mocha. And the woman who was working the espresso machine, she's quite talented. So kind of as soon as you hand her the cup, the drink's made. And so I handed her the cup, the drink was produced. And then up stepped the mother of the daughter who ordered and said, "Did you make that drink with oat milk?" And I said, "No, that wasn't ordered with oat milk." And the mother turned to the daughter and she said, "Did you order it with oat milk?" And she said, "No, I didn't order with oat milk." So I go back to the woman at the espresso machine. I was like, "Oh, they wanted it with oat milk," which is very common these days. Oat milk is like the quote unquote right thing to do, And so the barista said, "Yeah, well, I already made the drink and we're going to have to dump it out. And the policy there is if we make a drink and the order was in error, then we ask you to pay for half of the drink that we're going to dump down the drain. And we will also make you a new drink to satisfy your desire." And so I turned back to the woman. I said, "Are you willing to pay for half of the drink?" And she said, "I'm absolutely unwilling to pay for a drink that has cow's milk in it because I don't believe in drinking cow's milk." And of course, I didn't argue with her.
But she was willing to waste the cow's milk for one thing.
Exactly. Yeah. And so, and I'm not telling the story so we can pick it apart. I'm telling the story because I want to highlight how much she thought that she was doing the noble thing. And what actually happened was a lot of resources were wasted and a local business lost money. And I think this story has been sort of haunting me for the last few months because I think it really shows how the problem of climate change or the virtue of environmentalism has been sort of like twisted and weaponized by our culture, our colonial mindset.
It's still about what we're going to consume.
Exactly.
It's still based on consumption somehow.
But it's not based in that relational mindset. It's not based in that mindset of how am I either boosting this local business and regional resilience or not, right? Through my actions, through my decisions. And so yeah, I don't know if that takes us in the right direction for the conversation, but I think it kind of elucidates like the awareness has to be there in order for the decision to become clear, right? And then whether or not the decision feels accessible to you based on your positionality or your belief system, there still is an implication of it, right? That teaches us something about a new way of being, living well on the earth, as you say, Laura.
I think, yeah, because it gets very, I think you're right, though, it gets weaponized. It's like everybody, again, it's like, I'm going to do the right thing. I'm going to be virtuous. I am going to have an effect. I'm going to buy this, or I'm not going to buy that.
And then I've done my duty.
And then it's
right?
like, okay, I did the right thing. Well, no, we all actually are not doing the right thing. Even when we're trying to do the right thing, we're caught up in this wrong thing of just this prevailing system that's dictating how we're all consuming and participating in a way.
Yeah, it's dictating, but I think I want to put more responsibility on the woman who wanted you to. This is terrible. If you're out there, thank you for this example. We're not really picking you apart, but I think for me, I think in order to follow the 3 rules, you have to be willing to learn about the relationships that you enter in all the things that you do. And for me, what that story shows is this: somewhere a meme was heard, believed, cow's milk is bad. Cow's milk's bad for the planet. Don't drink it. And without thinking about it, and that's what that's what concerns me. Mm-hmm. That's where I think we often get on the wrong track these days, without looking any deeper beyond that meme. That becomes I decide I'm going to act that way. That's my behavior. That's an easy decision.
Truth. Right.
Yeah, it's an easy decision. I don't have to think about it. And really, that's, I think, what I'm asking. I'm inviting people to do is think more about it. That's what you're saying too,
yeah,
Meredith.
And I understand that like people are not privy to the level of knowledge that we have here in this room about what's going on with the food system. But I think recognizing that it is very complex, very corporate, very consolidated, and very political is another thing that comes up for me when I think about that story. Like when we're thinking about resilience and we're thinking about relationships, we have to understand that like, yeah, the food system is controlled by a very consolidated corporate oligarchy, essentially. And so then we get to look at those memes and think about, is following what this soundbite is saying or this dietary dogma is saying, is it feeding this external, non-regional, fragile, non-resilient, crippled by COVID, corporate, extractive system? Or is it something that feels a little bit more at the center, the core of the onion, right? As you say, like, is it? And I think like thinking about it in that systemic way is what I really have tried through my work to help people do. And what I've found is that it comes down to the orientation of consciousness less than it has to do with the facts that you have in your pocket, the skills that you have. And so as a result...
maybe she could have considered further, like, well, did the milk come from a local farmer? Did the oat milk come from across the
shoulda, coulda, woulda,
ocean?
Right? Yeah.
I'm just saying, like, those are things we could ask ourselves when we're saying, oh, like, that milk is bad, oat milk is good. Like, it's not that simple, right? So maybe when you're asking us to think about it, to actually really get deeply into, well, why do I think cow's milk is bad? And is all cow's milk bad? And where did this cow's milk come from? And is that a free-range cow? Or, I mean, those are all good questions,
But
right?
also, what are the implications of making a blanket decision about my diet on like the socio-political community ramifications of food in general? Because the fact of the matter is, and like I'm not ashamed about being political about this, and I'm not ashamed of being adamant that the work is justice oriented more than it is structure oriented. It's about building a different consciousness, and it's about building relationship and awareness more than it is about pushing diets or even building soil, or even, you know, because if we don't have that core consciousness and awareness, then we're not going to be able to keep up the work, essentially, and it's not going to go through it. So I think for her, like, there's nothing that she could have done differently in the moment. She was where she was at, but let's hope that her story is like educational for others, right? And starting to think about, okay, I've heard a couple experts on the radio tell me that, you know, the food system is controlled by some pretty powerful people who are getting more powerful, and like the land is getting purchased by, you know, more and more foreign governments and rich, powerful
foreign investors,
people, right? And so our capacity for that regional resilience is threatened. And so the decisions that we're making must become more informed. They must become more relational. They must become more in service of that regional wealth, that regional resilience, that reciprocal relationship. And they can't remain simplified or weaponized.
Well, I think one of the imperatives in this, in becoming regional, I'm not sure if we really made it clear, is that, like we were saying about COVID, but I think in your book, Laura, you do talk about anticipating not having the fuel, not having the things that we take for granted now, to live the way we're living now. So when we talk about
not
regional,
having the oat milk,
right? That oat milk,
or
which
maybe
might
make
have
the
come,
oat milk
or
yourself.
you make it yourself.
learn how to make it yourself, which is going to take us to the second thing that we wanted to talk about.
But
today.
could I respond just very quickly to something you just said? You know, I actually, when I speak about, you know, what may happen in the future and why we may want to change how we're thinking about food now, I really prefer to think about it as it's so clear that using fossil fuels have so many detrimental effects. It's not even that we may run out of it in the future. It's that we could choose to stop using it.
Not rely on it now.
Yeah.
Yes.
And
although
I
we
think
can't just like decide that today and make it happen.
Well, no.
So,
but at some point we need to start thinking about it. And I think the last decade has shown me anyway that that's a really tough shift in thinking. Just even beginning to think about it.
It really is. And which brings to mind another book I read, The Ecology of Care, where she delves deeply into like care, like hospital care, and how much of that is based on the use of fossil fuels. And so all this great talk we have about modern medicine, and we could talk about how great it is or not is, but it relies deeply on fossil fuels to continue in the manner that it's going. And so that's another thing I think that brings us back around to indigenous wisdom. Not to say that, you know, modern medicine has no value, but that we have to always, again, think like it's just like that milk or cow's milk or oat milk is the same with healthcare and other things, where we have to really think deeply about each thing and not respond like everything's a meme, right? And just try to figure out to respond with wisdom, right? With our own internal wisdom, and try to find that within ourselves. I think that's a thing in itself, right? Am I going down an unbeaten path here?
No, I mean, I think all the roads kind of lead back to that, I think, of how are we going to change our way of being? How are we going to change our way of knowing? And it's not necessarily a foreign knowing, like want to drive that home. It is rooted. And I think we talked about that in the last show. Sometimes cultivating these skills, whether it's like making your own oat milk or making sauerkraut or gardening, or it tends to connect people to and what feels like an old way of knowing that they've always had. It's like a remembering of something that feels really right. And we could wax all day about what that is, but I think, there is something to it, people are craving this.
I think you're right. And that is going to lead us into the second thing that we all can do. We'll take a little break first and listen to another soundbite and do station identification. We'll be back in a few minutes. Please stay tuned.
Of this regenerative economy movement. Founders and builders, philanthropists and nonprofit leaders, farmers and land defenders, researchers and filmmakers, and especially those who are working at the convergence of where crypto meets climate.
It doesn't matter almost in this day and age how much information you throw at people if you don't get at like the essence or the feeling or the connectivity it has to their human experience.
Economy means the management of home. Home as in our households, our work, our community, even our planet.
I want to invite all your listeners, and I try to invite my readers into this idea that actually we are all engaged in agriculture. If you are an eater,
yes,
eating is an agricultural act, and that was actually understanding that was what led to this list.
That group of people who called themselves conservatives, although they were identified at the time as being radicals because they're trying to tear apart this system that has produced a concentration of wealth in the sense that there's a compression between the people at the bottom and the people at the top, so that a CEO in those days, for example, of Ford makes about 8 times what a worker does. Now it's over 340 times.
You bring in some of the spiritual aspects of doing this work and some of the deep ancestral aspects of doing this work that I think are really seen as like outside of science, and we need more blending of that with science.
When recognizing the amnesia that many of us carry as to who we truly are and what this world truly is, my heart.
My name is Martha Senator. The show is Listen and Be Heard, and we're in the middle of a 2-hour special. My guests in the studio are Meredith Leigh and Laura Lengnick. And we are talking about what we all can do to have an effect on climate change. You were just hearing a clip. I wanted to mention the DJs for climate action. Some of the music you're hearing in the background of these sound clips, it's by those DJs. It's a global initiative harnessing the power of dance music and DJ culture to power climate solutions and generate action. They have a climate sample pack with a sonic toolkit crafted from field recordings gathered during years of Greenpeace expeditions and activism across the globe, and it featured sounds from all over the world of nature. And they've put this out for producers globally to use with the question, what does the future sound like? So that's one example of how people can come together to get into the minds of all of us together about how we can change and become more reciprocal in our relationships, and how that can actually have an effect, a positive effect on climate change. So I want to welcome once again Laura Lengnick and Meredith Leigh as we go on to discuss the second thing in the three things we wanted to talk about today, which is to learn a new resilient foodways skill. So, a new skill.
I think I want to hand this off to this award-winning chef. And
so maybe a little background on my work. So when I wrote the Ethical Meat Handbook, it was coming out of a farm. I lost my farm in a divorce and had all kinds of experience running local nonprofits that were about farmer training and education and consumer education, and also selling at farmers markets and trying to kind of be the change, right, that we wanted to see in terms of the provision of good local foods. And armed with all of that knowledge, and it wasn't all beautiful. There were a lot of questions I had about how are we really going to make decentralized systems for food production work for both farmers and consumers and for animals, right? Because my specific focus was meat. Not because I'm like a meat-crazed individual, but more properly because meat is immediately controversial and immediately asks us a lot of hard questions about what we eat and why we eat it and how we're going to go about doing that. And so with the publication of the book, which is not just about like eating meat and how great it is or anything like that, it's more about if you've made the decision to eat meat, how you might go about doing that with all of these resilience rules in mind, right? How to think about it from an economic perspective, how to think about it from a activist perspective, even if you live in a city and you're not a farmer. And so one of the things that I started doing after that was going around and dropping into communities where I was asked to come and teaching butchery and meat curing. And that's what I've been up to for like the last 8 to 10 years. And it's been fascinating because it really felt like a very grassroots way of bringing people together in their communities, and through the act of learning a resilient foodways skill, begin to change their consciousness about how they go about eating, about how they go about relating to each other, depending on each other. And oftentimes when I would leave those communities, there would be some synergy going that wasn't going before the workshop happened. And so I think when I think about learning a resilient foodways skill, it is in some ways very practical, very technical, but in other ways it's also, going back to our earlier conversation, it's relational and it's place-based, and it has a lot of power that gets us, towards resilience in more ways than just becoming more self-reliant or sourcing more locally or skilling up in a way that allows us to be more useful to those around us.
Yeah, what you said. What I was thinking about listening to, particularly toward the end when you were talking about how it changes something. There's a different kind of energy. One thing I was thinking about, I wonder if you would agree, is that very often learning these, of course I refer to it as a resilient foodways skill, but learning foodways. One thing that I think is true is that it requires individuals can't do that very well. It requires community. And so I wonder what you think about that. Am I making too much of it, or is that really something that is part of it? And then I think about, it used to be that communities got together to butcher the meat for the winter and to cure the meat and to harvest, and all of that was very much a community thing as well.
And that's major because, I'm experiencing that being on my own on this 6 acres. And, you could go out there and plant a bunch of seeds and, if you have good weather and it rains, and they'll all grow. But then come harvest time, can you by yourself go out there, harvest everything, process it all, and do whatever you're going to do with that food. No, you actually need help.
Yeah.
You can't do it yourself. This is like the thing I've come to. But also, when we consider that we're learning this skill, though, like that we did plant something, we did bring it in, and then we're going to ferment it, or we're going to can it, or we're going to recycle that container that we used last time. We're going to use, what we have, and even though we're going to consume that food, we're going to consume less around the production of that food when we grow it ourselves. And that is part, I think, of why we're trying to learn some traditional skills, is that, because when you go to the supermarket and you buy that stuff, then you're buying the packaging too, and you're paying into that whole production that went into that, the whole assembly line, everything else. And so that also required a lot of people. So it's about how we come together as groups and what we decide to do together as a group. And again, coming back around to, well, yeah, I want to do something, but I needed to be a we to actually really be effective. Well, I mean, I don't want to say we can't do anything effective on our own, but it's certainly something that we have to come together as a group in order to have those changes, like to be regionally self-reliant, like we were saying before.
Yeah, I would go with your original statement. We can't do anything on our own. We if we're going back to being relational and in reciprocal relationship, we're not gardening without a relationship with the earth. We're not fermenting without a relationship with microbes. We're not eating meat without a relationship with animals. And so we do, and I think this is a very important point that you've made, Laura. You're not making too much of it, because so much of that colonial mindset has been applied to homesteading of us. What homesteading means is you check out from society, you buy yourself a little land if you have the privilege to do so, and you start growing all the vegetables that you need. Like, how insane is that? If you really think about it, to think about how we're all going to become an island,
all self-sufficient,
when really the more realistic thing is like, you're not doing it out of relationship with the earth or microbes or animals, but also it's going to be more effective if we can become reliant on each other. So learning skills or completing skills in community further sets up that regional self-reliance, and that we are learning to become dependable and to depend on each other, and even lean on community as well as give to the community process. So I think, I would like to encourage listeners to think less about how can I become more self-dependent or self-reliant, but how can I be strategic about that and speak with potentially my neighbors, my family, look at the resources that are abundant from the regional community and what's missing. And then maybe I choose my regional resilience skill based on how I can become more in relationship with my place and my local relationships.
That makes a lot of sense. I think that we need to share our skills too, not necessarily try to learn all the skills ourselves, like you said, but to rely on the people who can do those things really well that we can't. And maybe if we see a hole in there somewhere, that's the hole that we try to fill with our own skills, or learn a skill that's missing somehow in our community.
Or maybe that's what I'm called to do. That's what I'm called to do. That's my superpower. To
go even further, over the course of my 20-year career, I have gained many skills and lots of knowledge. And I think the food industry that I've had to sort of fit into, I guess, in order to make a living, and I'm moving away from that now because it doesn't really fit with my ethical constitution, it kind of forces you to prove your charisma or become a celebrity, right? And say, look at all this knowledge I have, and look at all these skills I can give you. And that is in and of itself another twisted outcome of the colonial mindset. And I have come to know that all of the knowledge I have and all of the skills that I have are gifts. that have been given to me by the animals, by other people, by the land, and I believe by spirits. Like, I'm spiritual about it. And so all of those knowledges, I do not own them. And it is actually imperative that I give them away. And so it's about sharing. It's about receiving, and it's about giving. Like
notice,
just reciprocity.
It's reciprocity. And remember, I said earlier, what I have found is once I start living by these rules, they begin to reinforce each other. Yeah.
So what are some of the foodways skills? I started out actually, maybe 10 years or so ago, thinking of myself like you were talking as a homesteader. And I thought I was learning these old skills when I started pickling things and stuff. And it took me until very recently to realize that, like, fermenting is older than pickling and is actually what has been going on for a lot longer than pickling with vinegar, right? So that's one example. Like, we could learn how to ferment food. But what are some other foodways skills that we can learn?
I want to interject one thing, and then I want to hear what you have to say about that. And that is, I just noticed that what we're doing in this conversation, talking about this, one of the 12 things is learn a new skill, is bringing us into the second of the 12 things we want to talk about today, which is learn how your ancestors nourished their communities. And again, as with the 3 rules, what I've learned is these 12 things begin to reinforce each other. And I will hand it off to you, Meredith.
That's great that you said that, because I was going to go in that direction anyway. I think, but I appreciate that you're backing this up a little bit, Martha, to say, like, what in the heck are these resilient foodway skills that we're even talking about? We mentioned butchery, we mentioned fermenting, bread making is a really good entry point for some people.
Oh, yes.
But it's not just like kitchen-based activities. It could be gathering or foraging, gardening, composting, ways that essentially you are becoming more self-reliant and in relationship with your place in order to get your food. So you could take that and run with it. There are tons and tons of resilient foodway skills.
Composting is huge. One thing that I'm finding now, and I have to tell you, I'm a recent empty nester, so I've been dealing with teenagers for years now. And it's a challenge to try to get them to adopt some of these ideas that I'm also trying to adopt. And composting is one of the huge ones. When I look at all the cardboard that comes through our house, and I keep fishing out cardboard cartons out of the garbage that, my teenagers have thrown into the garbage. And I keep telling them, but they're not listening. And I shred it. I use it in the pathways on the garden. I don't throw out any cardboard anymore, like none, And even like some of the stuff that they tell us we shouldn't use, I still use it in the pathways or something, because that's another thing I think about. And when we talk about colonialism and this idea of just waste, another part of that is that we sometimes, we think we can throw our trash away, like, if we get rid of it, it's gone. But it's not. And so I try to look at everything that comes into my house and how can I reuse it, So like yogurt containers, I keep them for when I'm fermenting and pickling and stuff like that. Well, you can't use a sealed container for fermenting, but I use them to freeze things and stuff like that. Even takeout containers, I don't throw any of those things away anymore. So I don't know if that's a foodways skill, but composting is definitely one of those things. And there's like no food that I actually throw in the garbage, maybe because I have a dog and a cat and goats and all chickens. Somebody will eat that food as well. So not everybody has animals living with them and all of that, but what else can we do? We could compost. We can... You say other food waste skills that's not actually...
Waste. Yeah.
Right.
You're on the right track. And I think also like giving yourself a lot of grace. Teenagers are going to throw things in the trash.
Right. Giving yourself grace is a big one.
Yeah.
All of us, right?
Totally.
I mean, because we've been talking about, I want to do the right thing. And then we have to say, well, don't think I, think we. And just that simple thing, though, is very prevalent in our culture, to say I, what I'm going to do. I'm going to do the right thing. I'm going to do the wrong thing. Mm-hmm. Like it's our decision. Also just
getting into the pitfall of like, we're going to solve climate change by a whole bunch of individuals taking really virtuous actions and,
on their own,
washing all their plastic bags, which is a very good thing to do. But I think we also have to understand that some people are really suffering and they aren't safe enough to be thinking about every piece of garbage that they're putting in the garbage can. And we really do have to remember that the main culprits in this situation are petrochemical companies and large corporations and oil and gas, big oil, big gas, and the political framework that's attached to that. And so if we can just breathe and remember that, then I think it's easier to be like, okay, I'm just going to pick one thing today, or I'm going to try to help my teenagers form this habit, right? Turning the lights off, maybe over whether the banana peel goes in the compost or the trash, and not beating ourselves up if we're not checking every box. So while there are many, many resilient foodway skills from, if you think about the entire supply chain, from how you receive your food to how you throw away your garbage, you don't have to tackle every single one of them. Do you have other things to say about that?
Just what you said. Take it slow and do what you can and think about the we. Because I think we have been fed a fantasy that, buying a certain kind of milk or, an organic Twinkie, that's always my favorite example, is going to solve the problem. And this is just one more example of this individualism that is toxic.
Do they have organic Twinkies?
Really? Oh, I'm sure they do. They probably have regenerative Twinkies by now.
Help us all. Yeah. The other thing I want to say really fast, Martha, if like people are listening, they're like, well, I don't know how to pick my skill or whatever I'm going to do. I would say gravitate towards something that requires you to develop a ritual. Because I have found that that's one of the things that really becomes transformational for folks in terms of changing the way they feel their relationships are oriented or changing the way that their life is going. And so sourdough is a great example. You got to feed that baby every day or every week, and something that requires repetitive checking in with the project and a slowing down of the story that I'm too busy to take that on, I think is just really transformational. So you're not only building the skill set and having the more nourishing food item, but you're establishing something really sacred in your schedule, and that's ritual, and that is directly related to how ancestors fed themselves as well as each other and their communities.
Well, I think that's such a great thing to point out. It calls to mind for me an old saying from jazz musicians that I used to hear all the time, that repetition is everything. And that's from people who actually are expert improvisers. And I think maybe that's something good for us all to remember. And I agree, because I love to make sourdough bread. So that does call to mind exactly how that plays out in my life for me, because, I do like an Italian biga, so I don't have to feed that quite as much. But still, I have to, there's a routine, and you have to, know when to start your loaf of bread so that it'll be about ready to put in the oven at the right time. And all of that seems like a lot to think about when you start doing it. But when you get used to doing it, it becomes a routine. It becomes like repetition, a ritual.
And I would say, I learned this big time when I went through a really hard time in my life, making my bed every day. It was so healing to me to just make my bed every single day, especially because when you're going through a hard time in your life, oftentimes your bed is a place of turmoil. It's a place of grief. It's a place of sadness, tossing and turning and crying and having a hard time. And so you could have You could be in the middle of a storm in that bed during the nighttime, and you wake up and you make that bed. And if you walk into that room 4 hours later and you go, oh, look at that. It's a new slate. That ritual of doing that was life-saving for me. And in the same way, the ritual of, burping your sauerkraut jar, or feeding your sourdough baby, or taking your compost pail out, or, thinking about life as a gift and saying your gratitudes when you have your cup of coffee. Like, all these things are establishing ritual in the mind
comforting.
and in the life that is not only slows you down and makes you more aware, but I think also starts to rearrange the colonized mind.
Absolutely, because you're basing it more on the seasons and the actual, repetition that Mother Earth herself goes
Rhythms.
through, as opposed to, that clock that's imposed on our life of 9 to 5, and even just like how we just had to adjust to changing the hour. I hate that. So, it's absolutely, when you have your rituals, I think they are actually based on that relationship that we have, that reciprocal relationship we have. So if we get in tune with those rhythms, then probably we feel happier and healthier, maybe.
Well, I think what I'm hearing too in this conversation is that these sorts of little moments, I think about two things. You mentioned ecology of care earlier, and I totally see taking care of a sourdough or burping a fermenting vegetable. That's caring. You're caring for something, and that changes your relationship. I love what you just said, though. I want to remember it. It rearranges the colonized mind, and I think for me, the rearranging that's taking place in doing something like learning to ferment, or for me, one of the rearranging that's taking place is, first of all, I'm caring about a food. How weird is that? How weird is that? And it's also living food. Yeah, that's why you have to care for it. And I'm being very intentional and aware of the needs of that living culture, and doing what I can do to help it thrive. And all of that is, I think, pretty rare.
Yeah, and it's the same with gardening, or
with gardening, everything else. It's and it's something that is actively suppressed in the colonized mind.
In the go out and get what I need.
Yeah.
Fast.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what's sold to us, right? Just convenience.
Yeah, and actually consuming without awareness. I mean, that's viewed as a good thing.
Right.
Consuming without awareness.
That you don't even have to think about
you don't
this.
Have to
Let
think
us
about
take care of it for you.
We've got it all. Push the thing on your phone, and an hour later. Or lately, I just read a story, a pretty funny story about, was it Google deliveries with drones?
Oh, I saw that.
Did you see that too?
Amazon.
Yeah, Amazon delivery with drones, and it's got a long way to go. But my point is, really, what I'm thinking about is that you push a button, and an hour later, a can of soup gets dropped on your front yard. So, it's absurd. We've gotten to a place that it's absolutely absurd.
It is. I sometimes think like how much easier it is, like, to actually. I used to watch when I brought my kids to school. There'd always be like a long line for McDonald's breakfast, and I was just thinking about how much faster it is for me to just crack a couple eggs and put something in the toaster than to stand and to wait in line and get your fast food and then go wherever you're going to go to consume it, or maybe you're just consuming it right there in the car. But convenience isn't always that convenient.
And what I'm pointing out, though, is that there's just no attention being paid to that whole act of
and how nutritious could that actually be when you...
Yeah. I mean, the thing about that, and I was just talking with some girlfriends of mine about this, like how we give ourselves grace by being real about what privilege we have with our attention, right? So not everybody can crack a couple eggs into a pan and put some toast in the toaster. They got to go to the Mickey D's,
Yeah.
and
Right.
that's what they know, and not let's also not weaponize that, right? But like, what
It's what's sold to us, though, as
Yes.
being something to aspire to never have to think about cooking.
Yeah,
to
and I
have
think
it
that
be
that's what I was
convenient.
getting to, is like, when do we examine it? When is there the critical thinking of like, do I have another option? And if I don't, to trust myself, right? And if I do, to make the leap, right? I think that's just the only thing I wanted to add to that, is to not be dismissive of different people's abilities, accesses, or experiences, but to say, what we're after here is an opening of consciousness, and that opening of consciousness allows us to say, do I have another option? And trusting our answer.
And absolutely. And also what I think about then is, and can we reorganize our food system in this place to open up more options for more people? I mean, that would be the next
Rather than
level
criticizing the
logical
people
conversation.
online at
Right.
McDonald's, we might say, well, look around. What other options do people have? And can we encourage those options and make people aware of them?
And can we look to the past to see how our ancestors nourished their communities? Because it turns out there's a lot of good ideas out there for how we create essentially fast food that nourishes our communities, for example. It's about learning your own history.
Let's hold that thought and take a little break, and we will come back to that point.
When I say ancestors use me, when I say ancestors use me, what I mean is I surrender my life to you, to you, to you.
If we understand disease with this new kind of diagnosis, the treatment options become radically different. The deep medicine we prescribe to address the inflammation of people and planet has been prescribed by others
Finished
before
that
us.
project with USDA, determined to bring the voice of American farmers and ranchers into discussions around what was happening on the ground and the front lines of climate
In
change.
today's universities, farming and medicine are both taught through an ahistorical lens, which hides the legacies of land theft, genocide, and labor theft that their industries required to exist in these territories. The training is science-based, but selectively so, focusing on science that advances its agendas rather than interrogating its assumptions of power. Both farming and medicine had their education and policy shaped by
But
philanthropic
I like to
capitalism.
think about it as sobering. It's bringing to readers the experience from a farmer's perspective, from people who work the land, from people who actually their livelihood depends on dependable weather. And it's bringing that experience into the reality of all the rest of us who depend on these folks to feed
Kay
us.
Bombara is an African-American writer, and actually she was an English teacher, if you didn't know, Crypto. She wrote in the 1960s with the Black Arts Movement and emergence of Black feminism.
Amazing author.
Well, and then even today, this piece feels so fresh.
There's also something about science that just doesn't get at the way it all feels. We see that people are taking facts, very true, very, very stark facts, and going, I can't deal with this.
When I say ancestors use me, what I mean is
Why? My name is Martha Senator, and the show is Listen and Be Heard. And we're in the last quarter of our 2-hour special about some of the things that we can all do to have a positive effect on the climate, our neighborhoods, our communities, and to learn to be resilient in the face of climate change. My guests, Laura Lengnick, author of Resilient Agriculture, and Meredith Leigh, author of the Ethical Meat Handbook. And before our break, we were just beginning to talk about, well, not beginning to talk about, but Laura, you were talking about the way that our ancestors nourished our communities in the past. We didn't all have our own little kitchen with, all the nice little accessories in there. So one of the things that we can learn from how our ancestors nourished our communities is...
Well, what I was thinking about as I brought up that point was that we had a strong tradition in this country, maybe in the 20s or 30s. Can you help me with that? Well, it was in the first part of the 20th century of community kitchens. And folks would get together, harvest food, take it to the community kitchen, and work together to can or ferment or in some way put it up, and then share it out among all the folks that were able to be there, plus others in their community. So that's one way I know of specifically that I know happened here in Asheville. Lots of other examples, communities getting together to harvest, communities sharing things like the equipment you needed to harvest a grain, for example. So we have lots of examples of that and many others that I'm sure I don't even know about that can begin to get at this question of privilege and how do we begin to work as, and it's also, it's all so connected.
It's connected. I think the overarching point here is that things were done in community as a village, and there was reciprocity and reliance not only with each other but with the earth in ancestral ways of knowing. And that also relates to this feeling of overwhelm, or I can't possibly have time for this, this, and this, and this, because the system we're living in, the colonial system that dominates our thinking and our doing, has everyone very isolated and everyone trying to do family, gardening, homesteading, all the things on their own in a nuclear way, right? And so I think when we talk about building those networks of regional or reciprocal relationship, there is an element of getting into community that's very needed and very hard to do. I want to really
Why
name
is it
that.
so hard?
Because I think, let's think about the current tenor of our interactions with each other, right? Shall we?
Yes.
Like on the internet, for example, the discourse is very divisive. It's very sticky. It's very difficult to formulate an opinion without someone picking at it or attacking it, or we are being encouraged to be afraid of each other and to not trust ourselves, I think, by the dominant narrative. And I think because of the politics being so divisive, situations in the world becoming so divisive, that has real ramifications on people being able to relate to each other. Just recently, my husband said to me he had an experience where he's driving here in town in Asheville, and there was a bunch of cardboard on the road because Martha wasn't there to put it in her garden. And it was flying all over, big pieces of cardboard. And there was a gentleman driving a Jeep, and he had a huge piece of cardboard just stuck to the front of his vehicle. And my husband was like, oh, I should get out of my car and go get it off, because he couldn't see it. He was in the driver's seat. But he was like, I need to note that my immediate reaction to my thought that I should go help him was, I'm afraid that he'll think I'm coming at him. I'm afraid that he'll be afraid of me. Because that's kind of the situation that we're in when it comes to relating to others, the air quote around other, right? And so he said, I had to be very thoughtful about how I approached the situation. I did get out of my car. I waved at him. I got his attention. I signaled to him and pointed to the front of his car. And then I removed the cardboard and showed it to him. And after that interaction, the man was very appreciative. And there was a moment of connection between them that I think, I mean, I can't speak to what the gentleman in the Jeep felt, but my husband said it really made his whole day. The fact that he was able to overcome this fear that's sort of pervasive right now, whether you're posting something on the internet or whether you're helping a fellow community member out when they have cardboard on the front of their car. But actually, the direct balm for that fear is to connect with others and to help each other out. But I think it's really, you do have to cross a chasm psychologically these days to get that done. But you're not going to get into a situation where you have a strong village of individuals ready to make a whole bunch of kimchi, you know, if we can't cross those divides between us. So again, it's reinforcing one of our earlier points about getting into reciprocal relationship. But one of the things that ancestors did very well was the village approach and the reciprocal approach to basic needs and survival.
And it's a pattern we know in our bones.
We just have to find our way.
We just have to find
back
our way
to that somehow.
Yeah, and for those of us who have the advantages to be able to spend a little more time thinking about how to do this, that might be what you do to begin to cultivate a resilient community, is begin to think with other people, how do we create some space in our community to invite others in to do something like community canning, for example.
Yeah, and another thing is the role of conflict in healthy, resilient communities, I think is really important to highlight that we've become very averse to conflict and very threatened by conflict and very unable to do conflict in a radical way. But our ancestors, I mean, being in community means conflict will happen, right? But the conflict is generative. And I think getting to a place where we can recognize that a resilient community doesn't mean that everyone's aligned. It's not a cult. A resilient community is not a cult.
You have to listen and be heard.
Absolutely. Listening and be heard, and not necessarily agreeing all the time, but finding that new ground, as Laura's said before, not just common ground, but new ground as a result of multiple perspectives. And I think that's another thing that the food movement or other movements could learn from justice movements, is that there's this real concentration on how do we create truly relational village level networks to get things done. And a lot of that comes from stripping away colonial thinking, learning how to get into relationships, learning how to be in radical conflict that's generative.
And actually the justice movements really are part of climate action movement.
Absolutely.
Oh, yeah,
There's no separation of the two. They go hand in hand, and really, I guess, because we've been kind of skirting around colonialism and capitalism and these things. We're not skirting around it, but we mentioned them several times without really directly addressing them. But I think the overarching thing in that is just the injustice of, first, that relationship with the earth that's non-reciprocal, and then the relationship with the people who are actually in closest relationship with the earth are the ones who've experienced probably the most injustice as well.
Definitely.
Oppression. Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Well, we have covered a lot of ground, and we're going to come back and cover a little more. We're going to have some recommendations of books that you can read and ways that you can get involved in your community. We'll take one more little break to listen to something, and we'll be right back with that.
Part of the iterations of the board. And what I mean by that is I think that this particular version of the City Council and the County Commission could vote to include a budgetary item for a reparations initiative, but they would have, I think, a very difficult time legally saying that next year or 5 years from now, that future City Council is also bound by this.
I think the Black community, the indigenous communities, brown communities, I think folk will be fools to think that the elimination of the problem will lead automatically to the solution. And that's just not the case.
The water very naturally moves through a landscape in a certain pattern. And so food shed is an idea that we can think about food that way.
You just can't think of how many times a day you go to your water source, the tap in the kitchen or the bath, whatever it is, we take it for granted. And it's like gold in Hawaii and many, many cultures that live so close to their land and are so dependent on what Hawaii brings to you and how much it gives you and its abundance. And Hawaii did become it is a commodity all around the world. It's a global issue. It's a global value. And as a commodity, it means that people struggle to own it, to make it theirs, to control it. And a large crop like sugarcane, which came to Hawaii and became a huge cash crop and took over huge swathes of land since the late 19th century on. That land took over and, they diverted water sources, and it took away just the water sources that Hawaiians needed to grow their Hawaiian crops, their indigenous crops.
Even though I always was putting my voice in, I definitely felt pressure to have the answer and make it a one-size-fits-all thing. And then in the second edition of the Ethical Meat Handbook, I really changed on that and was like, look, we're all struggling with so many different and disparate contexts.
Certain spaces will be protected and we'll invest in, and other spaces won't be. They'll be left out, and that's always been the case with the marshland area.
Another reason participation is so important is to first of all, you have to be forgiving of yourself based on your context, and then choose the entry point that works best for you.
This is Listen and Be Heard, and I'm Martha Senator, joined by Laura Lengnick and Meredith Leigh. And we want to talk a bit about some books that you can read, some things that you can do in the community. Laura, you're sitting there with a list in front of you. You want to share it with us?
Well, as I was thinking about this question of coming together in community and making changes, making real change, or a term that I like to use is a just transformation, which really is bigger than food and bigger than climate change. And it's about decolonizing. We've brought that word up a couple times and talked about decolonizing our minds. But one of the ways that one new program or project that is really exciting me is a project that North Carolina is actually piloting, a big idea. And the name of the project or program is called Healthy Opportunities. And it's basically an effort by the state to recognize that there are multiple insults or multiple ways that our culture or our communities put people at risk. And it's more than just being hungry or not having transportation or not having a safe neighborhood to live in. There's a whole set of what are called determinants of health, social determinants of health. And I'm excited about this particular program because I see it as a first serious effort by the state and by those that are involved in public health to begin to grapple with this bigger picture. And to me, it's a good example of the beginnings of a true just transformation, or the beginning of decolonizing. In this case, healthcare. And so it's called Healthy Opportunities, and it's being delivered right now in the state. It's been 1 year so far that it's been doing. And what this, most simply put, what this program is doing is addressing 5 different needs of people for public health, or we can call it public health. And it's addressing not just food insecurity, but housing, food, transportation, personal safety. Do I live and can I live and work in places that I'm comfortable, feel safe in? And then also toxic stress. And so this is really beginning to get at this broader set of challenges to community resilience, to personal resilience.
That your doctor never asks you when you go to the doctor, right?
That's right. And particularly what excites me about this is it is an example of shifting investment from pharmaceuticals to rebuilding our communities. If you think about it, I mean, housing, food, transportation, personal safety, and stress, that's huge. We're beginning to get somewhere.
That seems huge to me, a huge shift in perspective.
Yes.
Because I know personally, like, I get so frustrated trying to deal with just going to the doctor when the whole mindset is just, well, either they can give you a pill for that or they can't.
Yeah.
If they can't give you a pill for that, then there's nothing they can do for you, which maybe that's true. There's nothing they can do for you, but maybe there's something that can be done in your situation if you refer to some older, more indigenous types of wisdom that are available, right?
And one reason I thought to give this example in this show today is just because it's, absolutely I'm behind community gardens, and there are many, and these, I mentioned it earlier, community kitchens, and looking back at different ways. But I also think that part of this path towards a healthier community is going to take shifting and changing how our existing programs work. So while this may feel, this example may feel a little bit distant and not necessarily, it's not like going to a fermentation class, at the Organic Grower School.
But
or
it's
something
getting
like
at our infrastructure.
But it's it's getting at some big questions and some major change. And this has been going a year, and it is so successful that individuals in this program are able to get off pharmaceuticals. They get healthy enough, and their families are getting healthier just by virtue of having this. I think about it as kind of this hitting multiple stressors in families all at the same time.
That sounds really exciting to me, actually, to hear that that's possible, that actually a governmental entity would take on that perspective is hopeful to me.
Yeah. So check it out, Healthy Opportunities. I have friends working in Asheville that are involved in this program, and one of the other positives is that folks in feeding programs here are so excited about how what they're doing is now part of this bigger picture, and it feels so important to them that rather than just dropping off food in a situation that there are many other stressors, that they're seeing the folks in this program actually benefiting and their families actually benefiting. So it is an example of working in community in the sense that now all of these groups that used to separately work, one on transportation, one on housing, one on food, they're now all working together.
That's very interesting. Do we have some other programs to talk about, or should we move on to books?
Well, I mean, I guess my input on this one is that my work has shifted or is shifting away from teaching workshops and skills because, and while I do think that is a very effective way to shift consciousness, I can't make my living doing that anymore. And so I'm moving to how can I more directly think about create capacity building. And so I've been really drawn to movement leaders and movement generation. So folks who have been working on relational capacity and healing, community healing for a long time. So if you're not familiar with places like the Highlander Center or the Social Transformation Project, or, earlier you played a song by Adrienne Marie Brown. She's a really inspirational movement leader right now and facilitator. Her book's Emergent Strategy and one about change that I'm blanking on the title of. But, those kinds of spaces are where I'm doing a lot of my reading and my studying, because while I do think there are very hopeful things going on to shift structures or develop structures that will really help address some of these colonial constructs, I think we won't be able to hold them up if we don't change our way of being and our way of loving each other and ourselves. And so most of my recommendations are along, kind of along those, how do we behave inside of those structures? Mm-hmm. And that's something that I'm doing a lot of thinking of. And I think what I also want to note there is the role of artists in that work. It's just so powerful to me, especially in this moment where there's so much heartbreaking stuff going on in the world. The people that have given me life and inspired me are not only the frontline people working for justice who are organized because they know how to do that relationally, but also the artists who are able to take all the grief of our time and synthesize it into something that radicalizes me towards being useful, towards being participatory. And, the quote that I shared with you, Martha, before the show is, the role of the artist is to make the revolution irresistible. Yes. That's Toni Cade Bambara or Bambara. I don't know how to say her name, but, that is something that I feel is really important right now. Supporting efforts towards justice building, learning and reading the books of those people opens the mind to new resources, a whole new library of thought leaders, and similarly making space for and supporting artists who are not afraid to place their work in the context of the world that we're living in.
Listeners can find links to a lot of the people that Meredith just mentioned, and others at listenandbeheard.net. I put some of those resources on the link to this show so people could go there and look and investigate further. I mentioned The Ecology of Care. I couldn't think of the author's name at the time. It's Dee Dee Pershouse. That I think is a very important book to read. Did you have some other books to suggest?
Well, one in this vein, too, that really has made a huge impression on me is Rupa Maria, her book Inflamed. And one of the aspects of Rupa's work that is really powerful to me is she is a musician, active musician as well, and so she's a doctor. Physician, she's a physician, and she writes about decolonizing the impact of colonization on our health. It's a lot, and we don't want to go into it right now.
Okay, but I do have a link to that as well.
Great,
at listenandbeheard.net.
Check that out. But then she also is a musician, and she does music around these issues as well. So.
Well, I want to thank you both very much for your time. Our two experts here in Asheville, North Carolina, another way to, find value in your community. I'm doing that now, I think, by sharing the knowledge of these two wonderful women with our listeners, Meredith Leigh and Laura Lengnick. Meredith is the author of The Ethical Meat Handbook, and Laura Lengnick is the author of Resilient Agriculture. And you will find links to both of those books as well at listenandbeheard.net. I want to invite our listeners to visit Listen and Be Heard at WLBH.org, a new 24/7 streaming radio station that I'm very proud to be starting, and another way, I believe, to create community. Next week, we have coming up, Tony Robles speaks with Frank Joya, who's a writer, actor, and playwright. And also we have multiple interviews from the North Carolina Writers Network Conference that happened last week in Charlotte, North Carolina. Thank you, Laura and Meredith, for being with me today.
Thanks, Martha, for having us.
And I want to thank our general manager, as always, Davian Dial at WPVM, and my co-producer, DJ Jeannie Hopper. My name is Martha Senator. I want you to thank you for listening and the opportunity to be heard.